Hi, my name is Owen Geis, and welcome to Early Christian Churches, a podcast where we dive into the history of the foundational churches that shaped early Christian Rome. Now let's begin. Rome, home to some of the world's most famous architectural masterpieces. The city is littered with landmarks like the Colosseum, the Arch de Constantine, the Sistine Chapel, St. Peter's Basilica, the Pantheon, and many more. But what about the buildings that lay in the shadows of these buildings? What are their stories? I'm talking about the early Christian churches. These buildings are less decorated and elegant than the tourist stops, but they're deeply significant. You could not remove the Christian church from Rome. It'd be like pulling at its heart. So how is it that these churches became so intertwined with the fabric of Rome? Well, in today's podcast, I'll be talking about how these three churches, the St. Stefano Rotunda, Santa Sabina Basilica, and Old St. Peter's Basilica, began that story. Well, let's look at the three churches to find the answer. Each one of these three buildings is located in proximity because they were anchored around significant ancient Roman sites. These buildings were the first step away from the Roman pagan architecture and a step towards establishing what we now call the modern church. First, St. Stefano Rotunda is located on a Sicilian hill, one of the 7 famous hills in Rome. It was consecrated by Pope Simplius in 468, and construction on the building lasted until 483, a span of about 15 years. This church is famous because it is the largest circular-shaped church in the world and was dedicated to the remains of the martyr St. Stephen. The church is broken down into 2 concentric circles and an octagonal altar in the middle. The outer ring, 108 feet from the center, is the exterior wall, and the inner ring, 35 feet from the center, is made of ionic columns. The roof is made of timber because the spans between these 2 rings is so long that it needed to be light. The exterior walls are made of bearing masonry brick with a reddish tone, and the central ring is lit by a clerestory window on a curved wall which allows for a 360-degree light cover. The altar in the middle is said to hold the bones of the martyr Stephen, and since its consecration has become a church dedicated to other martyrs, as seen in its numerous frescoes that cover the walls of the interior. In contrast with the standard layout of the modern church, it makes one question why the church did not take on this circular shape in its evolution throughout history. One idea could be that the seating of the congregation fixed around a single point does not allow for sacredness or a focused audience. The layout is too similar to that of a street preacher in the market speaking in all directions, or possibly too similar to the Colosseum style of viewing. Moving on, next on the list of forgotten churches is Santa Sabina of Rome, close to the Tiber River on the Aventine Hill. This church was built by Peter Elira, a Dalmatian priest, between 422 and 432, on top of an old Roman military housing project. This church was previously a secular Roman foreign gathering that housed courts of law, thought, and business, but when taken over by the church, it was converted for the use of worship and congregation. It was built of reddish Roman brick similar to the materials of the rotunda. The interior is made of beautiful white pillars and white marble floors and tan-textured walls, and a wooden truss roof system, like many of the other buildings in that day. The plan of the church is oriented along an axis running from the entrance to the apse. There's long and high columns along with arches that make it look like the walls are floating. One of the church's most defining features are its cypress wood doors. These doors are famous because they create an awe-inspiring procession from the regular world to that of the spiritual, or threshold, if you will. Sabina is similar to the Rotunda of Stefano in a few ways, including the exterior materials, style, columns, and arches, but nothing ties these 2 churches together more than their manipulation of light in the interiors. Clerestory windows of both churches, placed up high, create dramatic purposeful light washes across the interiors that allow for not too much reflection, but deep tones. Now, after examining 2 churches that are still standing, let's talk about the last church, which is no longer standing and is actually buried under the foundation of a church that is still standing, Old St. Peter's. Underneath St. Peter's is actually said to be St. Peter himself, his remains that is. St. Peter's was built in the 4th century during the reign of Emperor Constantine, the first Christian converted emperor, and it was a symbol for pilgrims traveling that Rome was now the center of the Christian world. The second reason is that it was built to host the growing number of Christian worshippers in the city. It was said to hold around 3,000 to 4,000 worshippers at any given time. During its existence, it held the papal coronations and was where emperors were crowned. It became the heartbeat of the Christian church in Rome. It was built on an axis just as Santa Sabina with a cross-shaped floor plan, but at a much larger scale. It was 350 feet long by about 70 feet wide. Its significance grew. As the significance grew, so did its funding and lavishness. It was also said to have Solomonic columns built into it, and that means that these were actually taken from Solomon's temple in Jerusalem and transported to Rome and repurposed. It seems a little bit like stealing, if you ask me. I don't know what they used to teach in the church, but I won't ask any more questions. For all of its significance to the church, it's strange that they actually decided to build it outside the safety of the city wall, because after it got filled with riches, artifacts, relics, and treasure, it quickly became a target for other countries to attack, and soon after they became in disrepair. Eventually, the church was torn down to rebuild a much grander and better one that we now see as St. Peter's Basilica by the end of the 15th century. Even though it was destroyed, it was the center of the Christian church and formative for many years, and therefore we owe gratitude to it. Hidden among the shadows and deep in the foundations of buildings, the history of Rome was created from these forgotten buildings. But it's still celebrated. Less elegant but more meaningful, these early Christian churches paved the way for a new form of life through the architecture that surrounded the Christian story in Rome. Thank you for listening.